Violence that erupted in the French Pacific territory of New Caledonia sparked a rise in global nickel price. The territory is among key producers of the metal essential for batteries, electric vehicles, and other devices. Russia Today's Charlotte Dubensky has the details.
Most of the media focus on New Caledonia right now is talking about the civil unrest and relating that to changes to the voting rights on the island, which locals claim will snuff out any hopes for eventual independence. While clearly this is a trigger point, it barely scratches the surface of what's really going on. Despite being some 16,000 kilometres from what you probably think is France, this Pacific island nation is actually part of the country's overseas territories. And it's important to Paris for several reasons. It's a base for the French military, and it's a source of a precious metal, nickel.
Nickel is wealth for New Caledonia. It is also, and I emphasize this, a major strategic resource for France and Europe, at a time when we have undertaken a massive reindustrialization effort.
Nickel's used in a whole host of products, including rechargeable batteries for hybrid vehicles. It's also used to make stainless steel, a crucial product for construction. Access to supplies is key.
It's just not about the nickel per se. All the nickel is very important, but it's about the sovereignty. So that sovereignty, not only it's also political, but it also economic. And part of that economic sovereignty has the element of nickel extractions, beneficiation, and then also the profit of it. France's strategy is very clear, being able to acquire, assess, and then make sure they exploit as much as they can.
This is also a story, he says, about competition on a global scale. China has been securing its nickel subsidies from nearby Indonesia at a cheaper rate. France and the EU, by default, want to stop China from flooding its market with cheap electric vehicles.
It's about a battle for resource extractions and management and taking advantage of that. China is leading the world. The Kanaks might be able to take advantage of that kind of wind of sovereignty that's blowing around the French Empire and then free themselves. But it might take a little bit of time. At that point, they can cut a deal perhaps with China or any other country that could help them. China is probably their best bet right now.
And as that cheaper nickel from Indonesia is becoming harder for the EU to access, New Caledonia's importance is rocketing.
New Caledonia could theoretically take up the slack in nickel supplies from Indonesia. The territory could declare independence, kick out the French, and invite the Chinese to invest in its mines and smelters.
As Alex Lowe suggested there, this issue over exporting nickel is deeply connected to calls by some of the indigenous peoples for independence, while France needs to remain in control of this precious resource. Yet while New Caledonia has vast reserves of nickel, mining it has become unprofitable. Paris stepped up with a proposed so-called nickel pact to sort this out. It said it would subsidise energy prices to reduce production costs. It would also invest in electricity production on the island. Sounds good? Well, not to many islanders, who say that in return they have to find some $65 million to finance that cost-cutting exercise, meaning new tax burdens.
Once again, Caledonians will have to contribute. This is all the more unacceptable as they already contribute massively to supporting the industry. That's a lot. And yet, the commitments required of manufacturers are non-existent.
Not signing the pact would put us in an extremely difficult situation, but the conditions are questionable.
That nickel pact has also been criticised by pro-independence supporters for its colonial undertones.
It's a colonial pact to take back control of New Caledonia's raw materials.
There is no withdrawal of sovereignty, none at all. We have to stop talking nonsense because afterwards, the militants on the ground say the state wants to steal our nickel.
Because what France isn't saying is that by having more control of the nickel sector, it tightens its grip on the island nation for generations to come. Nickel accounts for 90% of New Caledonia's exports and for 1 out of every 5 jobs. And just look at this map of New Caledonia. As you can see, the island is split into two zones. In the south, it's governed by a political party that wants to stay loyal to France. But in the north, where the province is governed by the Kanak independence movement, this is where the vast majority of nickel mines are.
There is what is called resource nationalism. There is a growing demand around the world where local people are attaching ownership of their natural resources to their sovereignty. That we can't be sovereign if we don't own our non-renewable and even renewable resources.
There's already a solid bloc in New Caledonia calling for independence, almost half of the population. And while it's failed to get its point across at the ballot box, losing 3 referendums since 2018, the movement is growing. New Caledonia has been a French colony since the 1800s. Those nickel mines were a big reason why France initially sought control of it, with European settlers heading there to strike it rich. And while they did, the local populations were marginalised. Social and economic inequalities are still obvious almost 200 years later. And for the younger generations, colonialism still persists.
We feel oppressed, we're angry. Everything is happening over there and we're wondering, are we, the Kanak people, being heard?
We've been lied to for years and years. They've lied to our ancestors. They've lied to our elders. Through the various agreements that have been made, we're on the 3rd agreement. It's the longest. We are tired of not being recognized.
What I realize is that they've never thought about us. They talk about sharing and balance, but that's never been the case.
All they want is to be recognized in their own country and to be allowed to run the country themselves. If you go to Fiji, they're Fijians. If you go to Tahiti, they're Tahitians. If you go to Wallis, they're Wallisians. It's only here in New Caledonia, when you arrive, that you find other people in the authorities. So, as someone who has been fighting for this cause since I was born, I don't understand why the truths are being hidden and disregarded.
Colonialism isn't dead. New Caledonians are still living through it. They're still having their resources exploited to benefit rich Europeans. France is cracking down on the current unrest as it's concerned about access to the nickel mines. And until those mines are stripped bare, Paris has a vested interest to keep New Caledonia under its direct control.